I want to believe. Quote from Victor Serge. The old world dug its own grave. It is now falling in. Let's give it a little shove. Millions of men who were nothing are rising to life. They are unable not to rise. We are those millions. Our only choice is to understand this and accomplish it with our eyes open. Through this consent, through this clear-sightedness, we escape from blind fate. All that was lost will be found again. By Victor Serge, from The Conquered City. Introduction. In the midst of barbarity, a new political opening has emerged. Since 2016, tens of thousands have participated in marches, blockades, and occupations against U.S. Border Patrol and ICE agencies, especially their concentration camp detention centers. Many of the detainees of these centers are Central Americans, forced to flee violence and poverty caused by U.S.-backed dictators and climate catastrophe. A capitalist ecocide, which also mobilized millions worldwide in the, quote, climate strikes in September 2019. That fall and winter, anti-authoritarian uprisings brought fire to the streets of Hong Kong, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Ecuador, and Chile, in a spreading heat wave of often ill-defined rage. That same month, thousands gathered in the Nevada desert outside the secret U.S. Air Force military installation at Groom Lake, with a far clearer mission. They had been mobilized by the Facebook event, quote, Storm Area 51, They Can't Stop Us All. It stated intent to gather a critical mass capable of overwhelming the military to rescue the extraterrestrial pilots believed to have been held there since the 1949 Roswell flyers. It stated intent to gather a critical mass capable of overwhelming the military to rescue the extraterrestrial pilots believed to have been held there since the 1949 Roswell flying saucer crash. Ironic as the movement was, millions signed up to its central demand: let us see them aliens. This book, about subjects many regard as marginal, cultish, weird, and silly, UFOs and Trotskyism, is written in the belief that there is something valuable in these confused, insurgent desires. They represent a flash of hope amidst the climate crisis, massive displacement of refugees, the return of ethno-nationalist myths, fascist strongmen, and senseless nuclear proliferation. As the political center breaks down, a new generation interrogates the neoliberal mantra that, quote, there is no alternative. The concept that history has dead-ended in bourgeois democracy. Hoping the dialectical process cannot possibly be at its conclusion, growing numbers of today's youth sift through history's dustbin, seeking figures tossed before their time, or at least some comic relief from the atrocious daily news cycle. This desperate dumpster dive has uncovered the works of J. Posadas, the working-class Argentine revolutionary who led Latin American Trotskyism in the 50s and 60s with a program of staring down capitalism and imperialism into and after nuclear war. When that, quote, final settlement of accounts never came, his movement faded into an irrelevant cult until his death in 1981. For decades, he was remembered only by a few rival Trotskyists for his extreme catastrophism and other bizarre features, most notably his appeals to solidarity with extraterrestrials and dolphins. In the 2000s, with the youth returned to the streets to protest globalization and imperialist wars, rumors of Posadism spread among leftist train spotters in remote regions of the internet, emerging into the meme mainstream during the political chaos of 2016. Today, he has been rehabilitated as one of the most recognizable names in the Trotskyist canon, at times even rivaling the inventor of the historical dustbin himself, Leon Trotsky. To this generation of semi-ironic revolutionaries, Posadas is the folkloric forefather of cosmic socialism, a patron saint of maniacal hope against rational hopelessness, whose futurist strain of apocalyptic communism and radical xenophilia represents a synthesis of barbarism and socialism, tragedy and farce. Although the more orthodox Leninist aspects of his program are usually ignored, his unlikely reincarnation perhaps foretells an imminent reencounter between the masses and ideas which, like first contact with aliens, have been long regarded as equally ridiculous, impossible, or insane: mass action, revolution, and communism. Alien invasion, after all, is less science fiction premise than historical fact. In the 16th century, generations of indigenous Argentinians circulated stories of strange ships appearing in the distance. No known craft matched their shape, size, or the way they swiftly glided from their unknown homeland for unknown purposes. Word had it that one landed in the interior decades ago. Locals fought them off, taking heavy casualties from their futuristic weaponry, before zipping away in retreat. Suddenly, what appeared to be their mother ship hovered on the Rio de la Plata horizon, and a small fleet of landing craft approached the shore. Despite rumors of their hostility, the Querandi greeted them like kin with bushels of meat and fish. More strangers arrived once they saw it was safe. Over the next 2 weeks, the gifts continued as the visitors constructed a base camp with a name alluding to the hospitable climate of this new world: Buenos Aires. Grateful as the newcomers must have been, they offered nothing in the way of reciprocity. After 2 weeks, the welcoming delegation decided to stop coming, and the alien commander, a syphilitic prince unable to leave his bed, sent messengers to the native camp demanding that the supplies continue. It was an insult beyond any excuse of cultural unfamiliarity, an act of dominance and war, implying that the strangers were to be given tributes as gods. The messengers returned to Buenos Aires badly beaten. Knowing a reprisal would follow, the Querandi gathered every tribe in the area to overwhelm the small village and repel the invaders. They soon learned that the legends of their superior firepower were true. After decimating their hosts, the visitors went back into their strange ship to drift further up the river and repeat the process again and again, their mud city left to disintegrate in the rain. The conquistadors soon determined that they had little interest in the vast expanses they named Argentina. After the Latin word for the silver, they failed to find there. Only after centuries of plundering the treasures of the Western Incan Empire did the Spanish turn back to the Argentine pampas, prairies expansive and fertile enough to feed all of Europe. They established a neo-feudal colony run by caudillo warlords and their gaucho knights, overseeing hacienda plantations, staffed by native peons and African slaves. Throughout the 19th century, a mercantile bourgeoisie based in the Buenos Aires ports overthrew the Spanish aristocracy and battled the caudillos for unitary rule. Their slogan was liberty, equality, and fraternity. Their symbol, a floppy red hat, both appropriated from the French revolutionaries in testament to the rationality and enlightenment that justified their rule. They further demonstrated their liberalism by abolishing slavery and conscripting the freed men as soldiers to further subjugate the caudillos and cleanse the remaining native tribes from the pampas. By the second half of the century, Argentina was open for business. It just lacked workers. Word spread among the dispossessed of Europe of an opportunity to double their annual wages, reaping a second harvest in the southern hemispheric summer. They arrived by the millions. Only the United States received a larger immigration wave. At first, the miserable conditions and lack of housing kept their stays seasonal, but as Buenos Aires expanded, and political and economic turmoil in Europe deepened, many put down roots. These Europeans not only brought their labor power, but their own interpretation of, quote, the Enlightenment pretenses on which the country was founded. The main liberty granted was the freedom to either work for the emerging capitalist class or the freedom to starve. These workers were certainly not equal to their wealthy bosses who lived in luxury while doing comparatively no work at all. And the relationship between these classes was better described as constant, violent struggle than fraternal. The economic crisis in the 1890s worsened the already bleak conditions of life for Argentine workers, cramped into conventillo tenements, and toiling in small shops without standards for pay, safety, or security. Inspired by the Paris Commune of 1871 that aimed to complete the egalitarian tasks of the French Revolution, and the 1886 riots in Chicago for an 8-hour day that led to the executions of several anarchists, they overcame divisions of language, ethnic origin, and religion to organize the Argentine Regional Workers' Federation, FORA, in 1901. It was the first centralized union in the country, dedicated not only to better pay, shorter hours, and lower rents, but to an entirely new way of life, free of hierarchy and exploitation. Unlike the recently organized and tiny Socialist Party, they did not seek to negotiate a social peace between the ruling class and the workers, or win state power through elections, but instead an anarchist and communist revolution that would leave the region classless, stateless, and governed cooperatively by a spirit of solidarity and mutual aid their alien predecessors so casually exterminated. In our apocalyptic era, it's hard to remember that a century ago, capitalism seemed like humanity's revolutionary coming of age, rather than its senile final hours. The Industrial Revolution advanced humanity so much in the 19th century that novelists and poets began to imagine what incredible feats were in store for the next. The combination of new science and speculative fiction created an imaginative sandbox for a not-too-distant future where humanity would no longer be bound by necessity, mortality, or even the earth itself. Mary Shelley mused that electricity would be able to revive the dead. Jules Verne imagined U.S. Civil War engineers creating a rocket capable of traveling to the moon. Advanced telescopic lenses surveyed the face of our neighboring planets for the first time. When what appeared to be a system of artificial canals was observed on Mars, widespread panic spread that humans were not exceptional. H.G. Wells was one of the first to explore this modern neurosis in his 1897 novel, The War of the Worlds. What if our Martian neighbors landed in Surrey and treated the British as they had their colonial subjects? The novel became one of the most popular books worldwide, inspiring dozens of similar works. Among these was Red Star, in which a young Russian participant in the 1905 anti-Tsarist uprising is abducted to Mars. Unlike Wells' Martians, this civilization was both technologically and socially advanced. Factories were fully automated, erasing scarcity and the need for money, since anyone could consume as much as they wanted. All non-automated labor was done voluntarily for the good of society. Everything was shared, including life itself. Young Martians donated their blood to the elderly to greatly extend their lifespan. Red Star's author, Alexander Bogdanov, was no mere fabulist. He participated in the 1905 uprising as a member of an organization dedicated to creating socialism on Earth, the Bolshevik Party. After 1905, Bogdanov was one of its most prominent and well-respected figures for his broad and innovative writings on politics, science, and philosophy. However, his utopianism put him at odds with a more conservative figure in the party, Vladimir Lenin. At a party retreat in 1908, the two sat down for a game of chess on a Capri terrace overlooking the Mediterranean. The setting was meant as a respite from the harsh and clandestine life of anti-Tsarist militancy. But, as they played, the game took on the tensions between the two leaders. Bogdanov argued that the party should stand their ground, agitating the workers towards class consciousness, and offering a positive vision of the fantastic new reality they could create once the means of production was entirely in their hands. Philosophically, he believed the collaboration inherent to the labor process of the industrial capitalist factory would break down the authoritarian structures of feudal and capitalist society, setting the stage for an intersubjective conception of reality. Under this new socialist epistemology, many like-minded Russian futurists believed science and religion would merge to fulfill the most fantastic messianic prophecies of literally abolishing death and traveling to the heavens. Lenin countered that the party should instead be monolithically organized with a clear hierarchy of responsibilities, and move towards legality by seeking representation in the Russian parliament, and suggested Bogdanov was essentially a mystic who should leave the politics to him and stick to sci-fi. Bogdanov won the game, but lost the party. The next year, Lenin published a polemic calling Bogdanov's materialist religion crypto-idealist, and his socialist epistemology solipsistic. Reality was objective, material, and best understood by a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries led by a militant intellectual core. The cultural revolution Bogdanov proposed could only occur after the party seized state power and revolutionized production on behalf of the ignorant masses. What the text lacked in philosophical or scientific soundness, it made up for in the confidence of its brutal denunciation, so scandalizing Bogdanov that he was marginalized from Bolshevik leadership. Undeterred, Bogdanov continued his work with a mass education project dedicated to the creation of a, quote, proletarian culture, autonomous from the state or party, the prolet cult. Even though Russia had an incredibly backwards economy and industrial proletariat compared to Western Europe, let alone Red Star's Mars, Bogdanov believed socialism could be breathed into existence with the help of a politically imaginative mass party, and, of course, the inevitable breakdown of the capitalist world order. One appreciative reader of Bogdanov was the iconoclast Leon Trotsky, who had his own unique ideas about the transition to socialism. Like the Bolsheviks and all other social democrats, he believed feudalism evolved into capitalism and then communism through a series of definite stages. For most socialists, this meant revolution should be anticipated in the countries where capitalism was the most advanced. But Trotsky believed that workers and peasants in backward countries could have a revolution that pushes it past the stage of liberal democracy to the sudden expropriation of the state and economy from the bourgeoisie, proletarian dictatorship. There was a glimpse of this in 1905, when initially anti-Tsarist demonstrations in some Russian cities led to advanced formations of insurrectionary proletarian struggle throughout the empire, workers' councils, or Soviets, outside of and against the state. Trotsky called the internal social effect and its external radiation, quote, permanent revolution, a constant internal struggle, in which all social relations are transformed. The economy, technology, science, the family, customs, develop in a complex reciprocal action which doesn't permit society to achieve equilibrium. End quote. It was an unorthodox theory for the time, and many socialist leaders thought it overly optimistic. But Trotsky understood that capitalism's global reach meant a crisis in one corner of the world would be felt in the other, a phenomenon that became all too clear when the assassination of an Austrian duke in a Balkan backwater spiraled into the largest war in the history of the world. Decrying the war as a senseless slaughter, Lenin and a small circle around him called for workers to strike, soldiers to mutiny, and the imperialist war turned into a civil war. Many socialists largely agreed with the internationalist sentiment, but, believing the working class was not ready to discard its nationalist ties, most voted to support the war. After just 2 years, industrial capitalism had transformed the traditional imaginary of warfare as quaint cavalry charges in green pastures into a previously unimaginable hellscape of constant shelling, underwater navies, bizarre flying contraptions, asphyxiating clouds of poison gas, massive bombs capable of imploding mountains, and gargantuan cannons to send the bombs flying to distant cities. Europe became a vast no-man's land of mangled corpses, disintegrating into the mud alongside the war's patriotic pretenses. Nonetheless, the mad butchers churning the meat grinder could only conceive of new offensive schemes, as if resolution could only be achieved by reducing entire cities and populations to smoldering tangles of shredded flesh and metal. As the absurdity of the war dragged into its 3rd year, mutinies and strikes spread in France and England, but nowhere with more intensity than Russia in February of 1917. As rumors spread among the starving masses that the already unpopular aristocracy, apparently under the sway of a drunken mystic, was planning to redouble their failing war efforts, they filled the freezing squares, demanding bread in scenes that resembled 1905. This time, the armed forces of the state joined them. The palace was seized, the royal family detained, and a provisional government established. The majority of it was socialist, almost all of them still believing their task was to transfer power from the monarchy to the bourgeoisie, who would continue industrialization and war under liberal democracy. That April, Lenin arrived from exile to St. Petersburg. For his heroic prediction that the war would lead to revolution, a crowd of his professional militants and citizen admirers gathered to meet his arriving train, like disciples awaiting the Messiah. Faithful as they were, none expected Lenin to tell them to throw all caution to the winds of history and push the revolution farther. The bourgeoisie were too terrified of the workers to be trusted, he said, so power should be taken from them, their war ended, the police abolished, and the transitional government replaced with a dictatorship of the proletariat, led by Soviet councils. It was a revolution that, once successful, would not only end the Eastern Front of the war, but spread throughout Europe and the world. His fellow Bolshevik leaders were appalled, many wondering aloud if he had become a Trotskyist, an anarchist, a German agent, or simply gone insane. Even Bogdanov called the April theses, quote, the ravings of a madman. Lenin pressed forward nonetheless, and in the coming weeks, as his ideas of expropriating the bourgeoisie proved massively popular among the people, he won the support of his party. In May, Trotsky also arrived back from exile, and suddenly found himself in total agreement with Lenin. For him, socialism was always a two-sided coin. On its tail, a humanistic and critical approach to economics seeking land reform and civil liberties. But its most potent thinkers, the ones whose heads would be added to the canonical totem of profiles, were able to transform that technocratic pragmatism into wild-eyed millenarianism at the crucial moment to preach a violent revolution in service of imminent utopia. With Tsarist forces regrouping and the war still in a grim stalemate, Trotsky and Lenin organized an insurrection to seize power in October. A dictatorship under the Bolsheviks was established, peace negotiated with Germany, and the socialists who decried it as a coup were removed from power. Quote, "You are miserable, isolated individuals," Trotsky shouted at them as they walked out of a post-revolutionary Congress. "You have played out your role. Go to where you belong, to the dust heap of history." End quote. The revolution's foes, however, would not go there quietly. Russia descended into a vicious 2-year civil war. Trotsky commanded the Red Army to a victory that cost millions of lives, as well as the libertarian pretenses of the revolution. The police force for whose abolition Lenin had previously called was replaced with another, which enacted a Red Terror to counter the White Terror of the Tsarists. Initially, their main targets were counter-revolutionary saboteurs, but as the war continued, socialists to the left of the Bolshevik dictatorship were rounded up and executed by the hundreds. Its culmination came in 1921, when an anarchist group of sailors denouncing harsh war rationing and suppression of peasant and worker strikes led to a mutiny at the naval fortress at Kronstadt. Trotsky sent the Red Army to suppress the rebellion, resulting in the slaughter of thousands of its participants. It was a risk Trotsky had foreseen before 1917, and now defended. The dictatorship of the proletariat turned it into the dictatorship of a vanguard party over the proletariat. Successful as they were in combat against all enemies, the true failure of the Bolshevik permanent revolution was outside their control. The proletariat in wealthy Western Europe, many believing the time was still not right to push towards communism, had failed to follow their example. The Soviet Union emerged from war impoverished and isolated, but still certain capitalism was in, quote, its death throes, and the resumption of the revolutionary wave would restart at any moment. The Bolsheviks initiated a mass industrialization program to restart production and move towards self-sustainability as they waited. On a visit to Russia in 1920, H.G. Wells, although a critic of Marxism, was impressed by the progress towards a communism Lenin recently defined as Soviets plus electrification, and the inspiration Lenin apparently drew from his work. Wells recalled Lenin praising the time machine for helping him realize, quote, that human ideas are based on the scale of the planet we live in. If we succeed in making contact with other planets, all our philosophical, social, and moral ideas will have to be revised. And in this event, these potentialities will become limitless, and will put an end to violence as a necessary means to progress. End quote. Rapid post-war modernization spread enthusiasm for a techno-socialist future to the grassroots of Soviet society. Particularly popular was the promise of space travel. Cosmist and rocket science pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky promised it would be possible to travel to space in a matter of only a few years. An explosion of popular science magazines, science fiction books, and films followed, all speculating upon what life in space would be like, and what incredible things we might learn from the alien civilizations surrounding us. At the space hysteria's peak, a near-riotous gathering of workers believing a manned trip to the moon was imminent was suppressed by Moscow police. Soon, Tsiolkovsky and his fellow cosmists and immortalists were repressed as well, their utopian visions thought to conflict with the practical goal of achieving Soviet stability. Lenin ordered Bogdanov's prolet cult absorbed into the State Ministry of Education, forcing him to find another venue for actualizing his futuristic vision of socialism. He opened a clinic devoted to proving the viability of the parabiosis practiced by the Martians in Red Star. He died after making himself a test subject, sharing his healthy blood with that of a sick patient, who eventually made a full recovery. When Lenin died in 1924, his preferred successor was Leon Trotsky. In his final days of illness, however, Joseph Stalin succeeded in maneuvering to marginalize Trotsky as a loyal, quote, left opposition to a communist party and international, the Communist Third International, or Comintern, increasingly under his control. By the end of the decade, Trotsky was exiled and forced to move from country to country under pressure from Stalin's agents in the international movement. Eventually, he made it safely to Latin America, where he started a Fourth International to weather the storm of Stalinism, fascism, imperialism, and the World War that would inevitably occur between them. He knew it would be small in membership and resources, but, believing that war would level the global order, the new organization represented a spectral hope for the return of international and interstellar revolution. Raised in the era when the Bolshevik Revolution echoed throughout the world, Posadas discovered Trotskyism as an alternative to the counter-revolutionary positions of social democracy and Stalinism. An adept union organizer and propaganda pusher, he climbed the ranks of the Fourth International to become the secretary of the Latin American Bureau. Emboldened by the Cuban Revolution in 1959, he split his sections into his own international based on the Latin American workers' movement and emerging guerrilla struggles. This was the peak of Posadas's influence, and it overlapped with the most ardent period of the space race, when the few Soviet cosmists to have survived the gulags propelled humanity to new heights with the launch of Sputnik. In no other era were the destructive and creative urges of humanity so obviously aligned as when intercontinental ballistic missiles designed to destroy distant cities were instead pointed upwards to take humanity to new heights, and one could credibly read Golden Age science fiction about utopian space colonies while huddled in a fallout shelter. As Posadas plotted his dramatic split in the fall of 1961, another small group dedicated to changing the world gathered for an informal conference in Green Bank, West Virginia. It was convened by Frank Drake, an astronomer and astrophysicist pioneer of the emerging science of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, S-E-T-I. 11 scientists were chosen from the emerging field, among them 5 Nobel Prize winners, chemists, neuroscientists, and astronomers. He greeted them at the opening of the conference with an equation scrawled on the chalkboard. N equals R times Fp, Ne, Fl, Fi, Fc, L. N meant the number of civilizations in our galaxy with whom we could plausibly communicate. If their work was to have any meaning, the multiplication of a conservative estimate of each term would produce a value of n greater or equal to 1. The first 3 or 4 terms were matters of exobiology, a new field of speculative science studying the possibility of life forming on other planets based on what is known about how it formed on Earth. The average rate of star formation per year, R, the fraction of those stars with planets, Fp, the average number of the planets that develop an ecosystem, Ne, and the fraction of those planets that develop life, Fl. With little debate, they determined, based on the vastness of the galaxy and the unlikeliness that Earth is wholly anomalous, that there were many inhabited planets. The next term, the fraction of that life that become intelligent, Fi, was more philosophical. What does it mean to be intelligent? In his History of SETI, 5 Billion Years of Solitude, Lee Billings described how neuroscientist John Lilly made a convincing argument that intelligence could be common on inhabited planets based on some of his unique research. He recounted his various attempts to communicate with the dolphins in their own language of clicks and whistles, and told stories of dolphins rescuing sailors lost at sea. He focused on one case in which 2 of his captive dolphins had acted together to rescue a third from drowning when it became fatigued in the cold water of a swimming pool. The chilled dolphin had let out 2 sharp whistles in an apparent call for help, spurring the 2 rescuers to chatter together, form a rescue plan, and save their distressed companion. The display convinced Lilly that dolphins were a second terrestrial intelligence, contemporaneous with humans, capable of complex communication, future planning, empathy, and self-reflection. Alongside the theory of convergent evolution, that similarities in environmental conditions led isolated populations to evolve in similar ways, the conference optimistically placed the chance of intelligence arising on 1% of the planets with life. The next 2 terms were more apt for science fiction, anthropology, and political theory. The fraction of that intelligent life that develops the ability for interstellar communication, Fc, and the average length that those civilizations persist with that ability, their longevity, L. The conference debated the emergence of empires and colonialism, and asked whether it would necessarily be preferable for intelligent beings to civilize, develop technology, and explore their surroundings. Ultimately, they decided a significant percentage of intelligent life would share our desire to discover our place in the cosmos. The only question left was how long a communicative alien civilization would survive. Philip Morrison, a veteran of the Manhattan Project, who personally assembled the atomic bomb that destroyed Nagasaki, made a bleak argument. If human civilization was optimistically used as the measure for the previous term, it should be pessimistically applied to this one. It was the youngest attendee of the conference, a shaggy-haired 27-year-old astronomer named Carl Sagan, who offered the most vocal defense of longevity. He reminded Morrison that they had already agreed on the vast quantity of alien civilizations, and out of that mass there would be a variety of results. Some civilizations could be like ours, perhaps destroying themselves the moment they discovered interstellar communication. But others would surpass or even avoid that moment altogether, moving on to a higher stage of wisdom and sustainability, in which they could discover the secret to interstellar travel and immortality. It was a potentiality, he reminded the conference, that still existed for us. Drake split the difference between Morrison and Sagan, setting the final term at 10,000 years. That gave them a result of about 10,000 contemporaneous communicable civilizations in our galaxy, and the conference ended with a toast to longevity, ours and theirs. The result may have satisfied most of the attendees, but Sagan believed the findings for N were far too low. He started a collaboration with Soviet astronomer Iosif Shklovsky to develop a fully scientific argument for his conception of extraterrestrial civilizations. In 1965, they published Intelligent Life in the Universe, which asserted that there are between 50,000 and 1 million advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and that we ought to attempt to contact them. Beginning a long quote. It is of no use to maintain an interstellar radio silence. The signal has already been sent. 40 light-years out from Earth, the news of a new technical civilization is winging its way among the stars. If there are beings out there, scanning their skies for the tidings of a new technical civilization, they will know of it, whether for good or for ill. If interstellar spaceflight by advanced technical civilizations is commonplace, we may expect an emissary, perhaps in the next several hundred years. Hopefully, there will be then still a thriving terrestrial civilization to greet the visitors from the far distant stars. End quote. Shklovsky closed the Russian edition of the book by making clear his belief that it would take the eradication of capitalism and the construction of communism to make human civilization sustainable. Sagan didn't exactly disagree, saying he hoped new systems could emerge more advanced than Karl Marx's still unfulfilled vision. He continued this coy distance to politics for the rest of his career, refusing to confirm or deny his belief in socialism as he steered SETI towards the explicitly political and implicitly anti-capitalist goal of organizing human life towards betterment and sustainability. An anti-war, anti-nuclear, and environmental activist, his love for the planet and humanity was best represented in the gold vinyl records he and his wife Anne Druyan, also ambiguously Marxist, loaded onto the Voyager spacecraft as a warm invitation bound for distant stars. The messages were vaingloriously utopian, Billings wrote, excluding references to such entropic human failings as crime, war, famine, disease, and death. Messages of greetings for terrestrial leaders in 54 languages combined with hundreds of idyllic images of our planet, songs from around the world, and a roadmap for how to find us. In the 80s, they televised their xenophilic conception of SETI to the masses with Cosmos, a show that made Sagan one of the most influential and beloved scientists in the world. By the time he passed away in 1996, their work made belief in extraterrestrial life and the value in attempting contact stronger among the public than ever. But this came at a time when federal funding for SETI was being slashed, alongside all public scientific and social spending, to nearly nothing. That research is today left to the mercy of private donors, unlikely to see any return from a search that could take millennia. It was a testament to how even science, liberalism's secular religion, could be stymied by that enemy of longevity which, he and Morrison both agreed, could not continue forever: capitalism. Today, one can imagine Sagan's immortals, or a socialist Martian from Red Star, looking down at Earth and wondering why we're still so backwards, belligerent, and self-destructive. The idea that we are being visited, abducted, or simply monitored by a vastly superior intelligence creates a sense of what the political theorist Jody Dean called the, quote, extraterrestrial gaze, a perspective that undergirds, quote, capitalist realism, the idea that liberal democratic capitalism represents the end of history and nothing better can exist. But just because it's hard for today's younger generations to understand why millions believed in communism during the 50s and 60s, doesn't mean they don't want a better world. Now that it's just as realistic to fantasize about a queer commune on Mars as drinkable water in Flint, jokes about, quote, fully automated luxury gay space communism communicate that if nothing is possible, then at least we can demand what we really want, since it remains as equally unattainable as our more, quote, pragmatic concerns. Revolutionaries have always pushed the argument that our true desires can only be achieved through the overthrow of the current social order, and Posadas injected a certain space-age catastrophism to this logic. He did so with an amateurish flair for speculation, and given what we know about nuclear winter, he was completely wrong. But then again, so was everyone else. Of Posadas's extensive catalog of unfulfilled prophecies, one summed up this tragic aspect of the Posadas comedy. Quote, "The joke will disappear," he wrote in 1976. "In 20 or 30 years, jokes will be old-fashioned. They are the result of these relations of private property to conquer difficulties, to struggle, to dispute. In socialism, there will be no necessity for humor." End quote. It turned out to be a type of internet joke, the quote, meme, that served as the genesis device of neo-Posadism. Images shared on social media portrayed the elderly Argentine in his gray jumpsuit and a shock of white hair imposed on a background of mushroom clouds, leaping dolphins, and whizzing flying saucers. The fact that humorous portrayals of eccentric aspects were foundational to his reemergence raises the question, is it better to be cartoonishly remembered or accurately forgotten? It was not just his bizarre beliefs that continued to make Posadas a joke, but that he believed anything at all. While the Posadists may be popularly remembered as brainwashed Bolsheviks or socialist Scientologists, their commitment to class struggle was very real. They fought in the Sierras of Cuba and Guatemala with Castro and Yon Sosa, organized factories in Argentina, Uruguay, Britain, and France, fought on the front lines of student movements in Mexico, and organized a mass movement of peasants in Brazil. They spent combined decades in prison. Some disappeared in the torture chambers or thrown from the helicopters of the Condor dictatorships. Were they all fools of a charismatic charlatan? Or was there a path to socialism that, through some errant coin toss of history, now seems permanently blocked? In Sagan and Druyan's final book, The Demon-Haunted World, they revealed a strange hobby of smuggling Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution to their counterparts in the Soviet Union so they could, quote, know a little about their own political beginnings. Likening Stalin's prosecution of Trotsky to American xenophobia or Dark Age witch trials, he hoped the encounter with their unknown origins could help guide them to a better future. Quote, "It's hard to keep potent historical truths bottled up forever. New data repositories are uncovered. New, less ideological generations of historians grow up." End quote. Messages of a dead and defeated past, whether they be failed revolutionaries or long-dead civilizations, still have much to tell us about our future. The nihilistic posture of today's youth, on the other hand, combines a recognition of the failures of the past century with an inability to imagine beginning anew. The possibility of revolution confronts them, in a sense, like a paranormal phenomenon. Though such a possibility may be described as a psychopathic delusion or demonic invocation by reactionaries, for those who have experienced it in moments of collective struggle, felt it like a premonition, or just read about it in books, it is an invitation to a reality radically freed from its preconceived limitations. Insurrection or first contact could come any day. Marxists and ufologists both tell us, but both are far more likely if we desire them, embracing a sentiment enigmatically expressed in a meme come before its time. A poster on the wall of a rogue FBI agent, Fox Mulder, in the 90s sci-fi noir The X-Files, hovering alongside a grainy image of a comically unconvincing flying saucer. The words, "I want to believe." End of introduction.